Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Cradle News Roundup, your one-stop shop for all news West Asia. My name is Esteban Carrillo. I am the head of news for the Cradle. As usual, I'm joined by my colleagues, content creator and writer for the Cradle, Karim Shamin, and columnist and editor for the Cradle, Sharmin Narwani. Before we start, I want to give a special shout-out to our VIP Patreons, Apathy is Suffocating, and Zachary Kirkpatrick. Thank you so much for your support. And for everyone else, please make sure to follow us, to subscribe, to like this video, to share it, and to check out our Patreon, when you can also become a supporter of the Cradle. In this week's episode, we are going to discuss the latest Yemeni attack in Israel, the intensifying threats coming from Israel towards Lebanon, and the Palestinian resistance quickly rehabilitating their fighting capabilities in Gaza. As a bonus content for the Patreons, we will also discuss Ukraine recruiting extremist militants in Syria and a recent meeting of Syrian tribal leaders who pledged their support for the government in Damascus. So on Sunday, the Yemeni armed forces sent a very strong reminder to Israel of its capabilities, launching a ballistic missile with hypersonic capabilities, or which reach hypersonic speed, hitting central Israel, hitting an empty field that was just a few kilometers away from Ben Gurion International Airport. This sent over 2 million settlers into shelters. None of the air defenses shot it down, although Israeli army leaders say that they did manage to hit it near the end of its trajectory, this ballistic missile. And this is kind of why, I guess, it fell in the open field. There's not a lot of information on this yet. You know how Israel likes to keep these topics close to its chest. According to Sana'a, the missile flew over 2,000 kilometers in 11 and a half minutes. That's over the speed of sound. That's past Mach 5.
Past Mach 5, and I think we were looking at even past Mach 10, potentially. When we did the calculations. What's really interesting is this around 2,000 kilometers that it traveled means it went over the airspaces of various Arab states. It went over spaces and potentially waterways where U.S. and Western air defense systems are deployed to assist Israel. So it bypassed not only Israeli interception, but also Western and Arab allied interceptions. This is significant. I think the other thing is, it did hit open fields, but it also hit a major railway station in Israel. And
they're saying that might have been an interceptor missile.
It could have been, but nonetheless, the fallout from this Yemeni ballistic missile. And very importantly, 2.3 million Israelis ran for the shelters when this took place. And Karim, who is, glued to the Israeli siren maps, to give warning of any impending attack, was just shocked at the amount of activity going on within, a half an hour period. They hit the Israeli triangle, the Tel Aviv triangle, Gush Dan, which is the most densely populated part of Israel in terms of population development. Yeah. And so 2.3 million Israelis, that is almost a quarter of the country's population, ran to take cover. What's also important about this is that it was a part of Yemen's Ansar Allah movements, the resistance movement in Yemen, their 5th phase, which they declared earlier this year, which is specifically to make Tel Aviv uninhabitable and unsafe, at least the perception for people. This is not the first during the 5th phase. It is the second. The first salvo was the Yemeni drone that flew undetected.
It also hit Tel Aviv.
It hit Tel Aviv. It was unintercepted, and that happened on July 19th. In response, the Israelis hit, and very badly, Yemen's Hodeidah port, which is their main lifeline. It's their lifeline. Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't just a little hit. There was a conflagration, that kept the port burning for a really long time. Though the Yemenis said that they addressed the struck areas and it was back in operation relatively quickly. But Israel did that to deter the Yemenis after the drone strike in July. And clearly, Yemen is not deterred.
No, it's not. Karim, what are the details of the attack?
I think they did the opposite. And they gave the Yemenis the reason to target facilities in Israel, because as we saw, the resistance is only targeting military facilities, yani Hezbollah, Iran, and the Iraqis, they were only targeting like military facilities. But the response of Israel over the drone strike on Tel Aviv that was made by Assadullah, they hit purely a civilian port where gas and petroleum were stored for civilian use. That gave the reason for Assadullah to target civilian facilities, and I think that's what will happen eventually. So regarding the details, as Shaheen said, the missile, according to Assadullah, only took 11 and a half minutes to reach Tel Aviv from Yemen, and it traveled 2,040 kilometers. And of course, the RO system, the air defense system of Israel, which they are very proud of, and they said that it's the best in the world. They didn't even say it's one of the best. They said it's best in the world. And now we see that Yemen, which also they say that they are like people of standards and that they are like third world country, managed to produce a missile, a domestic missile, during the war. They didn't have this missile or this technology prior to the war. This missile was only manufactured to deter Israel and to help the Palestinian and the aggression that they are facing. And this was an only one-time missile. They tested it on Tel Aviv. And that's, me as an Arab, usually we know since we are young, whenever war erupts in our region, I used to hear from my mother or my father or my relatives, they made a war, they want to test the new weapons. This is the first time I see Arabs are testing weapons inside Israel. So this is a significant thing. And also, we have to know that it was a ballistic missile, but it had hypersonic speed. Hypersonic speed, it means that it was more than 5 times as fast as sound, and Mach 5 till Mach 20 or 25. And there's no rule for this thing. And it was a ballistic missile because it escaped the Earth atmosphere and it reacted. And that's where it hit the target or it didn't hit the target. We know this missile, it was a sole missile. If there was like an operational retaliation, of course, they use more than one missile. This missile was like a test and a message for the Israelis and for not only Israelis. As Shani said, I think it's a message for Saudi Arabia, a message for UAE, for Jordan, for anybody.
The Americans?
Yeah, for the Americans. The Americans, I think, are the only ones that understood the previous messages because they removed aircraft carriers from there. And the Yemenis, like last month, they said, we won this battle because the United States removed their aircraft carrier.
For over 3 weeks, there were 2 aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
Not in the Red Sea, by the way, in the Gulf of Oman, because now they moved closer to Iran, and they sent one from back home.
Which is in itself an entire podcast, why they did that now, as Israel's threatened escalation.
You know, actually, let me just add a little parenthesis, because before I forget, they sent it back because on the previous days before giving the order, there was all of this noise about U.S. officials telling Israeli leaders, we cannot keep troops here forever. Yeah. And remember, if I'm telling you that they stayed for 3 weeks, it's because Israel is still awaiting the Iranian retaliation for the attack on Tehran.
And the
Yemeni. But obviously, the Iranian one is the one that is at the top of their mind. So they kept these 2 for 3 weeks, just in case, I guess. And then they were like, we can't keep like...
And also, what happened politically within those few weeks? Netanyahu showed that he would not agree to a ceasefire. And this could not be a more clear sign that the Americans are fed up with this. They're not going to put themselves at great cost and risk for an Israel that will not help them extricate themselves from this conflict and to de-escalate this potential regional war. The important thing, the other word, so the Yemeni missile attack, a single missile. Imagine if there was a number of them that came at the same time. What could we say of air defenses, the world's greatest air defenses at the time? It was launched on the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, okay, with the backdrop of what? Israel's threat to escalate against Lebanon. Even reports of them sending ground troops via the Lebanese-Syrian border and a whole host of other things. I mean, we are now seeing the kind of language. I mean, this has always been there, the threat of attack on Lebanon, but we've seen in the last week or so a different kind of language. When you think they would be looking for ways to de-escalate, because there's a lot of domestic conflict too, within the military, within the coalition government and the military, within the coalition government, within power, basically the Israeli establishment. So the missile happens with the backdrop of that, and Netanyahu's very clear rejection of a ceasefire in Gaza, which is why also the Americans said, we're just not going to hang around here while you diddle with us,
Exactly.
And the fact, and the other thing the Yemenis made clear is this is not part of the retaliation for Hodeidah, but this was specifically part of their fifth phase, and they were testing out their new weapon as part of this fifth phase. So what's also important, besides these little details we're getting in statements from the Israelis and from the Yemen's Ansarullah, is what are the takeaways from this operation that we can assess so far? Because I think there might be more over the next few days for sure. One is that Israel's massive strike on Hodeidah completely failed to deter Yemen, okay? Either from direct strikes on Israel or from the impeding of Israeli-bound shipments to the occupation state, through the Red Sea, through the Gulf of Oman, through the Indian Ocean, and Mediterranean. I think the second thing to note, and I'm sure everyone in the Western capitals is noting, is that Yemen's domestic missile production and technological capabilities go way beyond anything Western countries and Israel have anticipated. But Ansarullah has said these things, and they poo-pooed them. So today yesterday we saw something new. I think the third thing is that Yemen is clearly able to track U.S., Israeli, Western, and Arab air defense systems, how they're being deployed, because they keep finding openings in these systems. Its drone just went through tons of territory and waterways to reach Tel Aviv in July, and its hypersonic ballistic missile also did the same.
And look at what happened today. Before we recorded this, earlier in the morning, Sana'a announced that they downed a 10 MK9 Reaper drone, $30 million a pop. You count in 10, you're talking about $300 million that they have hit the U.S., by downing all of these drones. And just, yes, exactly what you say, Charlene. They keep hitting Yemen. They keep bombing Yemen, the U.S. and UK jets. They keep hitting them. They have not degraded their capabilities in the least. We're seeing evidence of that, right?
And I think the Americans and British thought that they would manage to do some big strikes on Yemen, and Yemen would back down. I mean, again, the other side, the pro-Israel side, the Western countries and the Zionist Arab regimes, they don't understand that deterrence does not work. It is not working with the unity of fronts in this version of the resistance axis in the region. It's just, forget the deterrence thing. You're just going to have to climb down your escalation ladder because deterrence is not working. Another point is, and I think this is important, with an almost 2,000 kilometer distance between Yemen and Israel, Yemen is the front. Okay, so we talk about Israel having 5 battle fronts now. Yemen is the front within the resistance axis to have infiltrated and hit deepest into Israel's geographical depth. Mind you, that sort of includes Hezbollah's last massive strike on the Israeli military intelligence headquarters just outside Tel Aviv, and its Unit 8200, which it now claims to have been a successful hit. So other than Hezbollah, which is a couple of kilometers away in Lebanon from Israel, Yemen, the furthest away of the resistance axis, has now become the one to hit, deepest into Israel's strategic depth. And then the final point is maybe that all Western attempts to threaten Yemen militarily with the UK and US navies, Israel's Hodeidah port strikes, and politically with the US envoy to Yemen threatening, using blackmail to cut off Yemen's humanitarian supplies. All of this has failed
there's no law that Western officials will go to, or that Israeli officials will go to. But, I think all the topics we're going to cover today are really intertwined, probably more than they usually are in our discussion. So I say, let's talk about Lebanon, right? Because as you're saying, Yemen is kind of the boldest front, I guess, at this point. Hezbollah has continued, the cross-border clashes have continued at an equal measure. On Sunday, something interesting happened. Before this, the ballistic missile, the Israeli Air Force, I'm imagining, dropped leaflets in the south of Lebanon telling residents to evacuate to the north.
Now, this is something we don't typically see here. We see this in Gaza.
Like when I first arrived here, I remember having, my wife telling me, we know the war's going to start for real once the leaflets come down, So this is obviously part of the psychological warfare, because right after it happened, the Israeli army said, well, this happened without our approval. We didn't approve it.
It was their brigade commander who had done it of his own volition.
That's what they said. That's what
they're saying. And exactly in 2006, war started with leaflets, and it ended with leaflets.
So they like their leaflets. So there has been this intensifying rhetoric. You have the Israeli defense minister talking about how the center of gravity is moving from Gaza to the north, how we need to, bring back the centers to the north. Things we have heard over the past 11 months over and over. But at this point, you do feel a difference because, it's almost a year. We're 3 weeks out from the first year anniversary of this horrible genocide. And there's been, it was a 1 day difference between, when Gaza, the Al-Aqsa flood, and then when Hezbollah entered. So we're nearing the 1 year anniversary also of these settlers having to essentially pick up their stuff and head out.
I think maybe the Israelis really took that decision to start an operation in the south, and because that's why they used these leaflets, because these leaflets were produced by the army, and it's not
they're already ready.
Yeah, there's no office boy. Look, go and print this. I want to drop them. And we have helicopters or just that throws them. But I think what happened is that the Yemeni missile maybe it changed the calculations with the Israeli army. So because Yemenis always say it, and yesterday they said it, that they will be the first one to retaliate against Israel if it starts war in Lebanon. And now they see their capabilities. And we have to know the capabilities just by the missile arriving to Tel Aviv. We saw, as Sharmin said, 2,300,000 people went to the shelters. And as we say always, Israel stands on two legs, which are...
It's myths and fairy tales that keeps a sort of victim image going, and Jews moving there, because now the reversal is happening.
So if I am a Jew, and I saw that 2.3 million Jews in one city went into shelters because of one missile, no way Israel can stand alone.
Especially since the intent of that missile and this phase of Yemen's war is to make Tel Aviv and its environs uninhabitable and unsafe.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the stated
That's what
goal of the Yemenis.
So with this, the crazy escalation with Lebanon comes on the back of several things. The Israeli media today reported that Hamas, the Palestinian resistance, is replenishing its unit faster than Israel is depleting them. And this comes on the back of one of our earlier podcasts, maybe a month ago, where CNN reported from the Institute for the Study of War and other organization that did a study on the Hamas battalions, saying that there were 24 Hamas battalions. So this is a month ago. And only and 21 of the 24 Hamas battalions still stood strong. And that any battalions that took significant hits were replenishing, no matter how much time it took.
Exactly.
So in the end, you're not degrading the enemy at all. You not only have not defeated them, you can't even degrade them.
Exactly.
And there's a very important point to talk about is how Israel or Netanyahu would act after this mission. Because last time they targeted Al-Hudaydah, but now if they are going to bomb Yemen again, there will be a very big pressure against Netanyahu and his government in whole of Israel except Tel Aviv, because we saw a missile that falls on Tel Aviv. If Israel retaliates and go bomb Yemen, everybody will be very mad at Netanyahu, especially the people that live in the north. And we know northern Israel, there's many there, including Haifa, Great Shmona, and many villages there. And there's many cities there that have 40,000, 50,000 of population. So if he retaliates, he will face a very angry street, especially in the north, because till now, according to the Israelis, because that's how they live and that's how they teach them in their schools, till now everyone in the north is asking Netanyahu to launch a war, and Lebanon had to turn Lebanon into a new vessel. That's what they want, but he's not giving them this to them, not because he doesn't want, because he can. But an Israeli who is taught since day one that they are superiors and they can do whatever they want, that's what they are currently asking their government. They are saying that, please look at us, look Hezbollah, what did for us. So if he retaliates in Yemen, it will be like a double-pointed sword for Netanyahu.
This brings us to, again, the confrontations from within Israel, okay? Because, again, today we're hearing Khan News, Israeli media outlet, said that Netanyahu is preparing to announce the dismissal of his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, which, by the way, we've heard almost throughout the course of this war, because they're at odds. Gallant is viewed as the...
Fired him, I remember, last March.
Yeah.
March 23, he actually fired him, and they had to bring him back.
Because the Americans, well, the Hags, they want what they consider a voice of sanity around Netanyahu, but at the same time, Gallant is no voice of sanity.
He mean like among Zionists, I guess.
Yeah, among right-wing Zionists, right? But I mean, even Lieberman, who used to be considered a right-wing extremist when he was, in a position of power some years ago, is now considered the left in Israel. So, he wants to replace him with Gideon Saar, who is a Argentinian colonist, and the hawkish leader of the New Hope Party that dropped out of the one of the coalitions of Netanyahu's coalition government early this year when he didn't get a position in the war cabinet, which is now defunct. At the same time, there's just news back to back. 1,000 Israeli soldiers and officers. We were talking about this earlier off camera.
That they want to resign.
Yeah, they want to resign. They want out of the army. They can see what's coming. I mean, why would they put themselves in harm's way? These guys are the weather vane of how badly the Israeli operations are going, But there's just something more which is a little snippet that came out, and I think we should look at this in light of Israel's threats to now go into Lebanon and launch war in Lebanon. So create German arms embargo on Israel. Okay, most requests from Israel for weapons from Germany are going unanswered. This maybe answers our question. We did a report some time ago saying that there were the Israeli media was saying that a number of capitals that supplied us with weapons, unnamed capitals, are now not even answering our phone calls. It turns out Germany, despite being the loudest on the scene besides the US, UK, and sometimes France, in support of Israel's genocide in Gaza, is actually not been selling weapons to Israel. So German arms sales to Israel dropped from 400 million euros to just 14 million in 2024, though they're approving the sale of weapon systems to Qatar and other countries. Okay, they're picking up the phone for others, just not for the Israelis. And this shows, I think this is where court cases and the ICJ and the ICC are having a deep, unseen impact, okay? Legislation is coming, not legislation, like government legislation potentially, but lawsuits, okay, are coming against countries and companies selling arms to Israel. And so these companies and countries are slowly trying to mitigate the liabilities for themselves. So I think that's one reason. So wait, Israel asked to purchase, per this report, thousands of tank shells from the government in Berlin last year, but has had no response. So not even as the genocide, really took on shape, but last year. How can Israel plan to execute a war on Lebanon that is very capable of taking out Israeli tanks, even back in 2006? Forget 18 years later, when it cannot even supply tank shells for its own military.
And Germany, just to mention, is responsible for 30% of weapons export to Israel. The rest, the US. I think Italy is like 1% or something like that, like some European country. What you're talking about, Shermin, brings me back to something that I saw earlier today. The retired ombudsman of the army, Yitzhak Brick, someone we will often bring up here. this Israeli doomsayer.
Because he, funnily enough, agrees with the Cradle's analysis on Israel.
No, and he is often right.
Which is because we all right.
He said in an analysis piece for Haaretz, in no uncertain terms, the Israeli army cannot defeat Hezbollah. And the plans that Netanyahu, Gallant, and Halevi, the head of the IDF, put Israel's very existence at risk. We're talking about the resignations, this wave of resignations. It's already been happening for almost 11 months. We keep hearing about it every so often. A bunch of reservists here, about another bunch over here. You've had the resignation of a police chief. You have the resignation of the ground forces commander of the Israeli army recently. You have the resignation of the head of the Unit 8200, a special unit, just a wave of resignations. On top of that, about the north in particular, remember that just a few months ago, the municipalities in the north, whatever they call themselves over there, the heads of these local governments, they were talking about seceding from Israel.
Yeah.
They were talking about just separating themselves from Israel. They keep talking about Netanyahu, his government, as you abandoned us. We have no protection from the government. We want the army to leave because they don't do anything. Mm-hmm. This has been going on for 11 months.
Speaking of the head of Unit 8200, which is Israel's special military intelligence and operations unit that carries out its assassinations, it's dirty tricks unit, basically. So in the Hezbollah's first retaliation just a few weeks ago, as we discussed at the Cradle, the operation had two parts. One was a decoy operation to send 340 Katyusha missiles into the north of Israel to heavily engage the Iron Domes and Israel's air defenses, while in another corner, Hezbollah was sending actual missiles and drones to hit its target, its real target, which was Israeli military intelligence headquarters and Unit 8200 specifically. Now, what's interesting about this is we were seeing things from different sources here and there, including an Iranian journalist who was very connected to the National Security Council in Iran, who was saying the head of Unit 8200, who is anonymous, people didn't know his name until by accident he screwed up, and by an email train, The Guardian found his real name and identified him. The Iranian journalists and others were claiming that he was killed in this operation. Now, we've never seen his face, and very shortly after this Hezbollah operation, where there was a military blackout, we saw nothing. We saw nothing on the ground. We don't know what damage was done. The Israelis were stone-faced, gray-faced, and very serious, and they did not retaliate. We believe that something significant happened, but even Hezbollah wouldn't disclose it. But this guy then announces his resignation. We don't know if he did or not. He could be alive, he could be dead. Anyone could announce his resignation because we're never going to see him, right? And he could be dead. But in this case, what happened is Al Mayadeen, a Arab region-wide television media outlet, published an article quoting a European diplomat confirming that 20 Israeli military officials or officers were killed during that Hezbollah retaliation, and 70 plus more were injured, which confirms to we at least what I was arguing in the last podcast. Kenny was faces because there was a big argument between Kenny and I. Kenny was like, we didn't see any results from it on video, therefore nothing happened. Whereas I argued the reactions were telling us something. I do believe that this is true. And then yesterday, I think, Hezbollah deputy chief, Naim Qassem, confirmed the Al-Mayadi report of senior Israeli deaths and dozens and dozens of injuries in that operation. And this is very significant. Could this information seeping out have something to do with Israel's crazy need to take on Lebanon when it doesn't have the resources? Its soldiers want to get out. Even its allies are not selling it the shells and the munitions that it needs. That the project is unwinding. They can't handle the West Bank. They're getting hit with ballistic missiles from Yemen. How could they possibly be thinking of attacking Lebanon?
So this is where it gets more interesting. Because last week, Lebanese daily Am Akhbar, a big report. in which they cite some informed sources talking about one of the plans that Israel has, or well, may have, and it actually calls, believe it or not, for them to enter Syria, for the Israeli army to launch a ground invasion into Syria, to cut off communications via Syria between Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, where they have been bombing, maybe not near as much as they have in the south of Lebanon, but to a significant degree. So between the Bekaa Valley and the south, they kind of cut off the flow of weapons. They talk about cutting the land supply needed by Hezbollah from Syria or Iraq, and to cut off communication between the Bekaa and the south. They talk about a ground military operation that they would enter southern and southwestern regions of Syria. Remember, this is where the U.S. has Al-Tanef base, this huge giant base that they occupy and allegedly train ISIS fighters there. And then the Israeli army would plan to advance eastward towards the depths of Lebanon to cut off the road. And one final thing of this is that this idea that they have, which we can discuss the validity of afterwards, is to exploit any advance it makes inside Syria to launch a major military strike against the Syrian army, which would disrupt any of its capabilities to help Hezbollah on the one hand, and encourage the Syrian opposition forces, aka US proxies, in the south and north to resume their battles against the regime in more than one region. So kind of like killing two birds with one stone, in their view. The Israeli army invading Syria. I mean, we talk about the Israeli army invading Lebanon and getting their ass handed to them. In Syria, well, first of all, the Syrian army, that up to this point in this conflict, they have been very hands-off. Right? They have been managing just within Syria, right? We can also discuss what exactly they've been doing. But inside Syria, you also have Hezbollah fighters, like the Hezbollah fighters that drove off ISIS.
Yeah. This kind of thing just sounds like fantasy until you start to look at what's happening on the ground, all right, in and around Lebanon. So, during the Syrian war, they had effectively tried to neutralize. So the West and the Gulf countries and Israel were just happy as could be because they had tried to neutralize a Lebanese border where Hezbollah would not only have to target its weapons and its attention to the southern border with Israel, but now look to cover its back on the Syrian border, because at that point, jihadists were infiltrating across there was no territorial integrity in Lebanon whatsoever, and Western allies in the extremist militant groups were traversing back and forth over that border, bringing weapons, bringing fighters, etc. But then that border was won back by a joint operation between Hezbollah and the Lebanese army, right? So this idea of Israel going to a weakened border, as they see it, because they view Syria as weak, is another way to infiltrate this border. What's happening on the Syrian border? As the Syrian war was unwinding, the British government funded and built 38 watchtowers inside Lebanon along the Syrian border, claiming to be wanting to monitor the border for, jihadis and weapons and all kinds of illicit things, right? No. At that point, we had a very senior military commander in the Lebanese government tell us off the record in a detailed interview that essentially the British watchtowers were intended to watch for British interests, the Syrian border, and also specifically to have eyes on Hezbollah's activities on that border, okay? Now, we're learning, again from an Al-Akhbar report, this is something Al-Akhbar reported a year ago almost, or month and month.
No.
Yeah, so late last year, that the British government was trying to push the Lebanese government to sign a memorandum of understanding. Let me say that again, a memorandum of understanding, which would allow British troops, free movement in Lebanon, to move their weapons and their equipment and their soldiers throughout Lebanon at will, Now, the Lebanese, when this was exposed, the MOU discussions went completely silent. It was an embarrassment for the government that this was even on the table. Lebanese were outraged. Why on earth would you want to do that? Okay, and so this is a memorandum of understanding the British presented to the Lebanese government sometime, I think, in July or August of 2023. Things have died down a bit, and suddenly the memorandum of understanding is being pushed again by the British government. Now exposed again, last week, in another Al Akhbar follow-up article. The way things appear to be is that the foreign ministry has rejected it on the basis of violation of Lebanon's sovereignty correctly. The Ministry of Defense, the defense minister in particular, has not said anything about it, as he and the Lebanese foreign ministry wait to hear from the commander of the Lebanese army. Apparently, this decision is being left to the Lebanese army, that is, whose commander, Joseph Aoun, is a pro-American military man who takes direct payment from the U.S. government for the Lebanese armed forces, okay? Circumventing the normal channels of when Lebanon, a sovereign state, gets foreign aid. No, this check gets cut directly to the command of the Lebanese army. So this is who we're waiting on to say, yeah, foreign troops can just, prance around Lebanon, moving their weapons and equipment at a time where we're hearing the Israelis might want to use ground forces and are threatening war. Okay, now what is the British excuse for why they want this memorandum to allow British forces in Lebanon? They're saying to prepare for an evacuation of British citizens in case of a war. Let us remind you that the memorandum of understanding happened last summer, well before October 7th, well before there was any conflict in the region, any threat of war between Lebanon and Israel. And they want to come and have free reign in Lebanon. So it's a lie. Basically, it's a lie. Now, if the British government wants to protect Lebanese citizens, why don't they go to the Israelis, whose bombs are the only munitions that will ever strike British citizens in Lebanon, and have a word with them? Furthermore, when about a month and a half ago, maybe end of July, early August, when people were rushing out of Lebanon, airport was,
overcrowded, like everywhere.
Overcrowded, flights were being canceled, people were, going to their embassies, begging for a flight out. The British embassy, among other Western ones, including the U.S. Embassy and Canadian Embassy, but the British embassy specifically said, we will not be evacuating our citizens. Yet they want a memorandum of understanding, okay, to bring their forces at the cost of millions and millions and millions of pounds sterling to Lebanon to supposedly evacuate their citizens, when a few 500-pound one-way tickets to back to the UK would have evacuated their citizens.
So let me read you the clauses of this MOU that is supposed to be for the evacuation of British citizens, right? They include granting British military personnel immunity from arrest or prosecution, adding that if any of them are detained, they must immediately be handed over to UK forces. They would also be allowed to move around the country armed and in uniform. Little piece of trivia. You know what country signs a memorandum of understanding like this with the U.S. Army?
Oh, okay.
In Ecuador, the U.S. Army can do this and more. Absolutely beauty. So good on Lebanon for not allowing the UK to get out.
The army chief, Joseph Aoun, has not said no yet.
Yes, but the Lebanese state can always fall back on the whole, like, we are not a government, we're a caretaker government, there's no president, etc., etc. One last thing, because I don't want us to move on before mentioning, because we're talking about Israel allegedly wanting to enter Syria via the ground. Last weekend, right, the Israelis launched a very heavy attack in the Masyaf area of Syria, of southern Syria. Very heavy bombing. And then a few days later, they claimed that this was actually covered for a ground operation, out of the latest Call of Duty video game, in which they entered an underground missile facility for chemical weapons and Iranian, missiles and et cetera, and so on and so forth. Via helicopters, full-on Hollywood movie. Michael Bay would be proud from what they described. So they say this, right? Like, this is why they were bombing so hard, that we destroyed this facility, we killed a bunch of Iranians, a bunch of Hezbollah, we went back, yay, Israeli army.
And they claim that they took bodies also.
Yes. So, and then it's like a back and forth. The Iranian officials called it fiction. This is the fiction of a Hollywood movie. They didn't say, mind you, because there was kind of different statements coming, one from Syria, one from Iran. The one from Iran said they didn't kill any Iranians. There were no Iranians killed. The one from Damascus said there was no ground operation. So, maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. Very difficult to tell. But to hear a few days later that then, like, their plan is, we're going to enter Lebanon through Syria to cut off the Bekaa from the south and do this and do that. After a few days after they claimed that they kind of already did something similar-ish, I think it's worth mentioning. It's worth bringing it up as well, because all of these things in the end are interconnected.
I just don't know why we're not seeing this in the UK press. I mean, I think the British people would be outraged at this notion. Really, truly, they have these D-notices that since October 7th, I mean, basically the British press has not been allowed to talk about British special operation troops operating in the Gaza Strip from very early on in the war. And, the Brits are everywhere. And it's something I think that at the Cradle we've tried to spotlight, because the Americans take center stage on a lot of these imperialist activities in the region. But oftentimes you have British masterminds behind these plans. And not only that, you have British operatives actually executing areas of these plans in all these situations, in Iraq, in Syria, in Gaza. It's time to shine a light on British operations. It's time to ignore the government, as British journalists, right? To ignore the government and write about illegal activities being conducted by now the Starmer government, the Labour government, for God's sakes.
So one last thing before we finish the main section of the podcast, and that is what you already mentioned a few minutes ago, Sharmeen. Hamas rebuilding their capabilities in Gaza. Look at that. 11 months into a bloody war, Gaza is flapping. Gaza is no more. Gaza is having a memory. Gaza is its people, is the survivors. That's what's left of Gaza. Nevertheless, the tunnels apparently, because first of all, the Palestinian affairs correspondent for Can 11 News, Elior Levy, said on Sunday that Hamas is preparing for the next stage of fighting, and that the rate of rehabilitation in the Gaza Strip is higher than the rate of dismantling, exactly what you said. And then on top of this, a couple of days earlier, an Israeli Knesset member, his name Ohad Tal, it puts out this very emotional statement. I can't go on like this. The IDF spokesperson is simply not telling the truth. And then he goes on to say that he knows from the summaries of security sources and other military sources that even if the numerical data on the killing of terrorists is accurate, which is not, he says in parentheses, we are talking about 30 to 40% of Hamas's strength in Rafah, not to mention the strength of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. There's no way out for Israel. Israel doesn't, the ceasefire is there. The ceasefire is there. Hezbollah, Yemen, the Iraqi resistance, Iran to an extent, have all said this is going to stop once the carnage in Gaza stops. Reach a ceasefire, they have said. Hamas speaks for the axis of resistance. This is what Hezbollah said a few weeks ago. So when Hamas decides to have a ceasefire, to accept a ceasefire, because mind you, what is being floated right now, it can be hardly called a ceasefire. Like after all of these ready demands and non-negotiables, and we will not pull out of
Israel have said specifically, even in after phase one, after we get hostages back, we're going to go right back in. That's not a ceasefire.
That's not a ceasefire at all.
That's a lull in violence.
Yeah, exactly. And look at, there was this report also completely worth mentioning, because just keep that in mind. Hamas is rehabilitating their fighting capabilities. And last week, some U.S. think tank, I forget the name, I don't have it here, they came out with these very stark figures talking about how 3/4 of all the deaths of aid workers in the world came at the hands of Israel. Israel is responsible for more than 75% of all the deaths of aid workers. Now, that's UN That's Doctors Without Borders. That's UNICEF. That's the Red Crescent, the Red Cross, etc. Any humanitarian organization that you can name that has been present in Gaza can probably point towards a victim that the Israeli army killed. And even with all of this brutality being unleashed in the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian resistance continues.
The fact that after all these targeted killings of humanitarian workers and of UN staff, that the UN, the spineless UN, has not taken its, most extensive measures to shut down Israel's war in Gaza. UN Security Council, Chapter 7, foreign troops can intervene, that kind of thing. Or sanctions, international sanctions against the sale of weapons to Israel and the sale of dual-use goods to Israel is astounding to me. It's astounding. The UN is literally useless right now. Though there is something interesting that is happening as the UN Security Council at a conflict like this that has the world's attention every single day, and it has not passed for, a year. As this progresses with the UN Security Council unable to do anything about it because of the US veto, basically, the General Assembly is stepping up and passing more and more resolutions. There is something that was passed in the UN about 2 years ago that allows is meant to begin the process of circumventing or somehow dealing with the UN and Security Council and veto problem, Because there are two sides in there, and if everyone vetoes on behalf of their allies and their axes and their proxies and their whatever, what's the point of the UN Security Council?
Useless.
So this thing that was passed 2 years ago was to allow the UN General Assembly to assess these votes in the UN Security Council, still not giving it teeth. But I think this is it's a course now. It's a new kind of course that the UN is on. It's an experiment. And the more the General Assembly stands up, I think the more the UN shows itself to be a non-functioning organization. Either the Security Council veto has to go, or it has to be revised so that the General Assembly can override it. Because right now, the UN is absolutely toothless on the Gaza war and on stopping Israel's genocide.
Just to mention that last week, for the first time ever, Palestine sat not as a member, but they essentially were giving a seat at the General Assembly. This is kind of like the biggest victory so far that this organization has been able to provide to a people that are seeing everyone in their families being wiped out.
I mean, I don't think we're waiting anymore for the UN. This conflict has gone beyond that. We now have, with the resistance in the region, dealing with Israel slowly boiling the Israeli frog. But Israel itself is boiling itself. Its actions are quite suicidal. In the decision-making right now, it's becoming more and more isolated. Even the U.S., right, the unconditional partner, is showing displeasure more and more often. You have statements poking out here and there from Blinken, from Biden, from others, showing displeasure with Israel, but they're not yet at a point, and this is largely because of the election. But I think we have a good amount of time after the election in which the incoming U.S. president, who will be new, will suck up to Israel, right, before realizing what a liability this is becoming for his or her administration. So, I think we're not going to see any major moves by the U.S., but we are seeing that the U.S. is really struggling with Israel at this point, too. I want to say, for those members who are not Patreon subscribers yet, that we have a very interesting section coming up, only for subscribed members, and it is to discuss this crazy movement of jihadis in Syria into not just the Ukraine theater, but into African theaters at the behest of Western powers to fight the Russians, Genuinely, jihadists are now legitimately Western proxies in wars outside Syria. So that's one thing. And the other thing we're going to discuss, as boring as it sounds, is 10,000 Arab tribe members got together yesterday and pledged their allegiance, not members, leaders, okay, and wealthy businessmen across not just the Syrian east, but throughout Syria, parts of Iraq and Lebanon even. I don't know if Jordanians were there because all these tribes are connected, and pledged allegiance to the government of Bashar al-Assad, okay? And pointing out that they are now going to mobilize against those who are stealing Syria's resources, i.e. the Americans and the Kurdish forces.
So with that in mind, please make sure to go to Patreon to subscribe, because this is actually a very, very interesting topics that we're about to touch upon. So with that, we thank you so much for joining us. Please make sure to like, to share, to subscribe, to find us on X, on Telegram, and to check out our Patreon, where you will be able to see some of the extra content we're putting out. For the Cradle News Roundup, my name is Esteban Carrillo. I have been joined by Charmin Narwani and Karib Chami.